The knock came at dusk, 3 sharp raps against weathered pine, and Cyrus Watkins stood frozen in the center of his cabin with a tin cup halfway to his lips and his heart hammering like a spooked horse against his ribs. 3 months, 92 days to be precise, because a man who had stopped speaking still counted things, still measured the silence in units he could control. 92 days since he had heard his own voice. 92 days since he had let another living soul know he existed. He had chosen this canyon, this remote hollow carved into the red rock country of southeastern Arizona territory, precisely because nobody came here. The trail was unmarked. The creek that ran past his door appeared on no surveyor's map he had ever seen. He had paid cash for this land from a prospector who wanted to forget it existed, and the transaction had been conducted in near silence because Cyrus Watkins had already begun practicing his disappearance before the ink dried on the deed. 3 more knocks, harder this time, not the tentative tap of a lost traveler, not the frantic pounding of someone fleeing danger, deliberate, patient. The knock of someone who knew exactly which door they were standing in front of. His hand found the Winchester leaning against the wall before his mind had fully formed the thought. 92 days of solitude, and now this. Now someone standing 6 inches away on the other side of a door he had not opened for another human being in 3 months, and every nerve in his body was lit up like a prairie fire because the secrets he had buried himself out here to protect were not the kind a man survived having discovered. He pulled the door open. She was not what he expected. He had not known what he expected, but it was not this. A woman standing in the amber last light of an Arizona evening with a surveyor's transit balanced on one shoulder, a leather satchel bulging with papers slung across the other, and eyes the color of deep creek water that looked at him with absolutely no fear whatsoever. "Cyrus Watkins," she said. Not a question. He said nothing. His voice had gone somewhere in the last 92 days, and he was not certain it would come back on demand. "I'm Olive Merritt," she said. "I'm a land surveyor working under contract to the territorial government, and I need to tell you that your cabin is sitting on approximately 4 acres of a contested mineral claim, and there are men who know it, men who are coming here, and if you want to keep breathing past next Thursday, you're going to need to listen to everything I have to say." The silence stretched for a full 10 seconds. Then Cyrus Watkins did something he had not done in 3 months. He stepped back from the door. He opened it wider, and he let her in. He had come to this canyon in the autumn of 1883, 6 weeks after the thing in Tucson that had unraveled his entire former life like a spool of wire dropped from a moving wagon. He was 31 years old. He had been, until that autumn, a man of considerable reputation in the territory, which was not always the same thing as being a man of considerable honor, but he had worked hard at making those 2 things overlap. He had served 4 years as a deputy marshal under a man named Aldous Briggs, a man he had trusted completely, a man he had believed in the way young men believe in the things they choose to follow into dangerous country. Cyrus had been born in Missouri in 1852, the second son of a farmer who worked land that never quite gave back what he put into it. His father was not a cruel man, but he was a tired one, and tired men sometimes press their tiredness into the bones of their children. Cyrus had left at 17, drifted west with the current of restless young men that the post-war decade kept generating, and had found his particular talents lying in the direction of horses and tracking, and a steady hand under pressure. By 25, he was working cattle drives out of Texas. By 28, he had his deputy's badge and a reason to stay in one place. He had believed Aldous Briggs was different from the other men, who wore authority like a costume over their actual intentions. He had believed it right up to the moment he walked into the back room of the Territorial Land Office in Tucson on a September afternoon in 1883, and found Briggs meeting with 3 men whose names he recognized from wanted circulars, and watched money change hands in quantities that explained a great many things Cyrus had filed away under the category of puzzling coincidences. What he had witnessed was the architecture of a betrayal so vast and so precisely engineered that it had taken him several minutes standing in that doorway unseen to fully comprehend its dimensions. Briggs was running a land fraud operation of spectacular ambition. He was forging mineral surveys, filing false claims against land that legitimate settlers had worked for years, and then using the marshal's office as the enforcement arm of the scheme. Men who resisted the fraudulent claims were arrested on manufactured charges. Men who resisted arrest were dealt with by the three men across the table from Briggs, men who were not constrained by the formalities of law or conscience. Cyrus had walked out of that building, saddled his horse, and ridden into the Arizona wilderness with the weight of what he knew pressing down on him like a stone and the certain knowledge that if Briggs discovered he had been seen, the three men with their unconstrained approach to problem-solving would be saddling their own horses within the hour. He had told himself he was protecting himself. He had told himself during the 92 days of silence in the canyon that he was thinking, that he was planning, that he was not simply hiding from a secret that had grown too large and too dangerous to carry alone. He told himself many things in the silence. The silence did not argue back. He built a fire now, because the October nights in the canyon dropped fast and cold, and because it gave him something to do with his hands, while Olive Merritt spread papers across his small table with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions and on shorter notice. She had dark hair pulled back with practical severity and wore clothes that were sensible without being mannish, a dark skirt and a working blouse under a canvas jacket with extra pockets, and she moved with the particular confidence of someone who lived in their own competence the way other people lived in their houses. "You don't talk much," she said, not looking up from the papers. Cyrus poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot on the stove. He set one near her elbow. He sat in the chair across the table and waited. She looked up then, and those creekwater eyes assessed him with a directness that was almost startling. "That's all right," she said. "I talk enough for 2 people when I need to, but at some point tonight you're going to have to confirm some things for me, and for that you'll need to locate your voice." She paused. "Whenever you're ready." Something in him eased very slightly, like a rope with one thread cut. He wrapped both hands around the coffee cup and looked at the papers she had spread out. They were survey maps, hand-drawn with extraordinary precision, filled with the notation system he vaguely recognized from official territorial documents. But these were different from the maps he had seen in the land office. These were honest. He could tell the difference, he realized, because he had spent 4 years seeing the other kind. "How did you find this place?" he said. His voice came out rougher than he expected, disused, like a door hinge that needed oil, and the sound of it after 92 days of interior monologue startled him into a silence that lasted another 3 seconds. Olive Merritt did not flinch or make a production of the moment. She simply answered, which he would come to understand was characteristic of her. "Your land purchase," she said. "The prospector you bought from, man named Hollis Crane, he filed a secondary mineral claim against this parcel 8 months before you bought it. That claim is what the men I mentioned are interested in. Crane sold you the surface rights and filed a separate mineral claim without telling you. He's been paid by a party in Tucson to create a legal mechanism for displacing you." She tapped one of the maps. "I've been surveying this entire basin for the territorial government for the past 6 weeks. I came across the discrepancy in the claim filings 2 days ago. I looked up who owned this land, I found your name, and I wrote out here because if nobody warns you, you'll be dead or dispossessed before the month is out." "Who sent you?" he said. "Nobody sent me," she said with a precision that was not quite sharpness but was close. "I identified a problem and I am addressing it. That is what I do." He looked at her for a long moment. "You said the men who are coming. Who are they?" She met his gaze without wavering. "One of them goes by the name Decker. I don't know his first name. 2 others. They've been following my survey route. which tells me they know the mineral claim is about to be verified by official measurement, and they want to move before that happens. The name Decker hit the inside of Cyrus's chest like a stone into still water, and the ripples went all the way to the bottom, because he knew that name. He knew it from the back room of the Territorial Land Office, from the face of a quiet, careful man who had sat across the table from Aldous Briggs and received his payment with the specific unhurried manner of someone who considered violence a professional service rather than an emotional indulgence. He said, "You need to tell me everything you know about who is behind this operation. Everything." She looked at him again with those assessing eyes. She was reading something in his face, he realized. She was deciding how much to give and how much to hold in reserve, which was the calculation of a person who was not naive about the world's tendency to turn information into a weapon against the person who had gathered it. He recognized the calculation because he had been making it himself for 3 months. "I'll tell you what I know," she said, "but I want to know why it matters to you specifically." "Because the way your face just changed when I said that name, that wasn't the face of a man hearing a stranger's name for the first time." So they were going to be honest with each other. He had not planned for that. He had not planned for anything about this evening. He told her. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. He told her about the back room in Tucson, about Briggs, about the money and the men, and the moment he understood the shape of the betrayal he had been living inside without knowing it. He told her in the rough, unpracticed sentences of a man who had not spoken for 3 months, sentences that sometimes broke off and had to be restarted, and she listened without interrupting, which was a generosity he felt more acutely than he would have expected. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "So you witnessed the entire operation. You have direct knowledge of Briggs's involvement. You are the single most valuable witness that could exist in a case against him." "And the single most useful person for him to have removed," Cyrus said. "Yes," she said. She did not soften it. "Which means that what I told you about Decker coming here is not a coincidence. Briggs knows where you are, Mr. Watkins. I don't know how, but he does. The mineral claim is almost certainly a mechanism to get you out of that cabin and into the open." The fire crackled. Outside, the canyon was settling into its full nighttime silence, the particular silence of country so remote that even the wind seemed to have agreed to moderate itself. He looked at this woman who had ridden alone into his hollow at dusk, with a surveyor's transit on her shoulder, and a collection of maps that revealed a conspiracy, and he felt the specific dislocation of a man whose carefully arranged solitude has been interrupted by something more important than his solitude. "You rode out here alone." He said, "I did. That was not a safe thing to do. I'm aware of that," she said. "I calculated the risk and decided the information was worth it." A pause. "Also, I'm quite capable of taking care of myself." He did not doubt it. He doubted very few things about Olive Merritt by this point in the evening. She had grown up in Kansas, she told him later, when the conversation had moved past the immediate crisis and into the territory of two people beginning to understand each other's edges. Her father, Thomas Merritt, had been a surveyor himself, one of the men who had laid out township lines across the Central Plains in the years after the war, and he had brought Olive along on surveys from the time she was 8 years old, because she had a gift for mathematics that exceeded his own, and he was honest enough to recognize it. She had learned to use a transit, a theodolite, and a compass chain before most girls her age had learned to manage a household. She had learned to read topography the way some people read books, fluidly and with deep comprehension, understanding the story the land was telling about water and fault lines, and the deep grammar of how terrain organized itself over centuries. When her father died in 1878, she was 23. She had been assisting on official surveys for 2 years by then, and she had made the decision, which was not a simple one in 1878, to continue the work under her own name. It had not been easy. There were men who refused to accept survey documentation that bore a woman's signature. There were others who accepted the documentation only after having their own surveyor verify her measurements, and whose verification always confirmed her measurements exactly, which over time had built her a reputation among the people who cared about such things as an absolutely reliable professional. She had come to Arizona Territory the previous spring, contracted by the territorial government to complete a comprehensive survey of a basin in Cochise County that had been generating mineral claim disputes for 2 years. She had been working it methodically ever since, and it was her methodical nature that had eventually led her to the discrepancy in the Crane filing, and then to the trail that ended at Cyrus Watkins's door. "Do you ever get frightened?" he asked her. It came out more directly than he intended, but she answered it directly. "Yes," she said, "but I've learned to distinguish between the kind of fear that contains useful information and the kind that's just noise. The fear I felt riding out here today was the useful kind. It was telling me to be careful and observant and quick, so I was." He was quiet for a moment. "You're describing fear as a tool. Isn't that what it is?" she said. "If you use it right." He thought about the last 3 months, about fear as a reason to go still and silent and invisible, about the difference between a tool and a cage. She stayed the night. There was no question of her riding back through the canyon in darkness with the possibility of Decker's men somewhere in the surrounding country, and she accepted the offer of his blanket on the cot by the far wall with the matter-of-fact practicality of a woman who had slept in worse field conditions and was not about to manufacture a crisis of propriety out of a sensible arrangement. He slept in his chair, or rather he sat in his chair in the firelight and thought about what she had told him and what he had told her, and what the next several days were going to require. In the morning she was up before him, which surprised him, standing outside in the early light with her transit set up on its tripod, sighting something across the canyon with the focused absorption of a person at work. He stood in the doorway with his coffee and watched her. She moved around the instrument with a fluid efficiency that spoke of 10,000 repetitions, adjusting, noting, recalculating, and there was something in the sight of it. A woman doing precise scientific work in the clear Arizona morning, with the red canyon walls rising behind her, and the light coming golden and clean over the eastern ridge, that struck him in a place he had not expected to be struck. He had grown up with a particular inherited set of ideas about what women were capable of and what they were for, ideas that his years as a lawman in a rough territory had bent somewhat but not entirely reshaped. He knew women of practical skill and formidable intelligence. He had respected them, but he had not before this morning watched someone be simply excellent at a technical discipline with such obvious and complete mastery, and felt the specific quality of admiration that tipped over into something else, something he would not name yet but would not be able to forget. "You need to come look at this," she called, without turning from the eyepiece. He walked over. She stepped aside and gestured for him to look through the transit. He bent and put his eye to the scope. "What am I looking at?" he said. "The northern end of your property line," she said. "See the stake at 200 yards. Now look 20 yards to the left of it. There's a second stake. Someone put it there within the last 2 weeks, the wood's still fresh cut. That's not a survey stake from any legitimate filing I have on record." He looked. He saw both stakes. He straightened up. "Decker's men marking a boundary," he said. "Marking a boundary they intend to make legal by violence if they can't make it legal by paperwork," she said. "Which means they're close, closer than I thought." He felt the old clarity that had defined him as a lawman coming back online, the part of his mind that assessed terrain and threat and available options with the detached precision of a chess player. 3 months of silence had not erased that capacity. It had only buried it under the accumulation of guilt and grief and isolation. He felt it stirring now, and he felt simultaneously relieved and ashamed that it took a woman standing in his doorway to wake it up. "We need to get your survey documentation to the Territorial Land Office before Decker's people can file anything else under the Crane claim," he said. "That's exactly what we need to do," she said. And we need someone in that land office who isn't Briggs's man. There's a federal land commissioner in Tombstone, he said. Name of Harwick. I don't know him personally, but I know he was appointed from Washington and he came in after Briggs's network was already established. He may be clean. She considered this. Tombstone is 2 days' ride. 2 days there, 2 days back, he said. With your documentation and my testimony, Harwick could initiate a federal inquiry that would freeze any action on the Crane claim. Your testimony, she said. She looked at him with a steadiness that made him want to be worthy of it. You'd have to speak. To a federal commissioner, on record, I know, you came out here to disappear. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that unlocked something in him that had been sealed shut for 92 days. She said, I think you came out here because you didn't know what the right thing to do was, and you needed time to figure it out. I think you've been trying to be a man who doesn't act from fear, but fear got there first, and you've been waiting for something stronger to come along. She paused. I'm not saying that as a criticism. He looked at her for a long time. The canyon was warming around them, the light losing its morning quality and becoming the full, honest light of day. No, he said at last, I don't think you are. They packed what they needed. She had her transit, her satchels of documentation, her instruments. He had his Winchester and his horse, a steady gray gelding named Luther who had been with him since his deputy days, and enough supplies for 4 days on the trail. She had a solid bay mare she called Meridian, which he recognized as a surveyor's term for the north-south line, and which told him something about the inside of her mind that he found quietly charming. The trail out of the canyon was narrow, and they rode single file. He in front watching the country ahead with the attention of a man who has been reminded that he has enemies. The terrain was rugged red rock country, interspersed with juniper and scrub oak, and the October light gave it a particular beauty that was sharpened by the awareness that danger was somewhere in it. Beauty is sharper when something dangerous shares the air. They had been riding for 2 hours when Olive said, "Pull up." He did. She was looking at the south-facing hillside to their right with an expression he was learning to read as focused calculation rather than alarm. "What?" he said. "Someone was camped on that shelf," she said. "Look at the color of the rock where the fire was. The soot stains fresh, 2 days old at most." He looked. She was right. There was a darkness against the pale rock that was too uniform to be natural shadow. A fire ring, cold now but recent. "How did you spot that from the trail?" he said. "I'm trained to read terrain," she said. "I notice when something is different from how it should look. That ledge has a dark mark that doesn't match the natural patina of the surrounding rock." She scanned the hillside above it methodically, working in sections the way she worked a survey. They moved on, probably early this morning. "They're ahead of us on the main trail." The shock of it hit him cleanly and honestly, not the strategic information, though that was important. It was the specific quality of her seeing it that stopped him. He had spent years as a tracker, and he had not spotted the camp sign from the trail. She had, using the same systematic observational discipline that made her a precise scientist, and applied it to a completely different domain with zero hesitation. He had never in his adult life encountered a woman whose capabilities so thoroughly exceeded his own in a practical survival skill, and the encounter with it produced in him something he recognized, after a moment, as profound and genuine admiration. Not the patronizing admiration of a man complimenting a woman on doing something better than he expected women to do, but the real thing, the respect one capable person feels for another when they are confronted with the honest evidence of superior skill. "We'll go north," he said. "There's a secondary route through the mesa country, longer by half a day, but it keeps us off the main trail." "Show me," she said. He drew the route in the dirt with a stick and she studied it and then nodded, consulting the compass she kept on a cord around her neck. "That bearing takes us through the San Pedro Valley watershed," she said. "We'll have water." They turned north. The day was long and the country was demanding, and they talked as they rode, conversation braiding itself into the landscape around them, the way, A creek braids into a valley. She told him about a survey she had done in Colorado Territory, a high mountain job that had required her to haul her equipment up to 11,000 feet in 3 feet of snow. And she told it without self-congratulation, simply as a thing that had happened and had required certain responses. And the telling of it made him understand that her courage was not the dramatic performative kind, but the steady architectural kind, the kind that holds up buildings in weather. He told her about a search he had led as a deputy marshal, tracking a man through the Dragoon Mountains for 8 days, and about the moment at the end of it when he had found not a fugitive but a dying man who had run from injustice and run out of time, and about the specific grief of arriving somewhere too late. He had not told that story before. It had been inside him for 3 years, and the telling of it now surprised him, the way things you've held tightly sometimes release all at once when you find the right moment. She listened. She said, "That sounds like it changed something in you." "It made me think about what justice actually is," he said. "Not the word, not the institution. The real thing, whether it ever arrives in time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think it sometimes does, but only when people decide to carry it forward themselves rather than wait for it to arrive on its own." He did not answer, but he thought about it for the next several miles. They made camp that night in the shelter of a limestone outcropping that blocked the wind and provided a clear view of the approaches from 3 directions. She assembled the campfire in the same systematic, efficient way she did everything, building it small and hot rather than large and visible, and cooked a trail meal from her supplies, dried beans and salt pork and cornbread. She mixed and baked in a small Dutch oven she had apparently been carrying in her satchel, which he had not expected, and which was better than anything he had eaten in 3 months. "You carry a Dutch oven on a survey," he said. "I'm out in the field for weeks at a time," she said. "I learned early that if I wanted to eat decently, I was going to have to arrange it myself." She poured coffee from the same efficient pot she had produced from the same inexhaustible satchel. "Men on survey crews always expect someone else to sort out the food. I found I preferred to sort it out myself and eat what I actually wanted." He smiled. It was small, the specific smile of a man who has forgotten he can make that expression, but it was real, and she saw it, and something in her own expression shifted very slightly in response, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. That night, wrapped in their respective blankets on opposite sides of the low fire, he lay awake longer than he should have, and listened to the canyon country around them settling into its deep nighttime stillness, and thought about the last 3 months and the specific quality of this day compared to the preceding 92. The silence of the canyon had been the silence of avoidance. This was different. This was the silence between 2 people who had talked enough for 1 day and were comfortable not talking, and that was the rarest and most telling kind of quiet. He thought about her. He thought about the transit on her shoulder at dusk, and the fresh camp sign she had spotted from a moving horse, and the way she had listened to his story about the dying fugitive in the Dragoon Mountains, with the specific quality of someone who understands that another person's grief is not material for a response, but simply something to be received and witnessed. He thought about the word forbidden and how he had been applying it for 3 months to his own past, to the knowledge locked inside him, and how strange it was that it did not apply to what was happening now, though it perhaps should, given that she was here on professional business, and he was a man who had not spoken to a soul in 3 months, and was possibly not in a condition to trust his own responses to things. But the thing about Olive Merritt, he was beginning to understand, was that she did not invite the application of unnecessary caution. She was too clear, too direct, too genuinely herself for the kind of distorted seeing that lonely men sometimes impose on the first woman who walks through their door. She was not a projection of his loneliness. She was a specific and particular person with her own history and her own formidable competence and her own reasons for doing what she did. And he was attracted not to some softened or simplified version of her, but to the actual thing. The intelligence and the independence and the willingness to ride alone through hostile country, because she had concluded that the information she was carrying was worth the risk. He fell asleep thinking about her eyes and the honest way they looked at things. In the morning she was already up and had water boiling before he had fully assembled his consciousness into its daytime configuration. He watched her for a moment before she knew he was watching, and she was looking at the eastern sky with the compass in her hand, taking a bearing on something, her lips moving slightly as she calculated. She did not look like a woman waiting to be noticed. She looked like a woman doing mathematics. He got up and helped break camp without being asked, and they were moving by the time the sun cleared the eastern ridgeline. They reached Tombstone late on the second day, the town rising out of the high desert with its characteristic combination of ambition and dust. The sounds and smells of the mines still present beneath the overlay of commerce and conflict that had accumulated in the years since the silver strikes. It was October 1883, just over a year since the events at the OK Corral, and Tombstone was a town trying to decide what it was going to be now that the spectacular violence of its early years had settled into a more routine form of instability. Cyrus had been here before, many times as a deputy. He knew the geography and the rhythms of the place, and he steered them away from the main thoroughfares and toward a smaller hotel he knew on the quieter side of the business district, a place run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Beaumont, who kept a clean house and asked few questions and who had always been square in his experience. He asked for 2 rooms. Olive paid for her own without discussion. He found the Federal Land Commissioner's office the next morning, a small suite of rooms above a hardware store, and he was not entirely surprised to find that Harwick was in, because the territorial mineral claim disputes had been keeping federal officials busy for months. What he had not anticipated was being recognized. The man who looked up from the desk when Cyrus and Olive entered was a compact, precise-looking man in his mid-40s with the kind of careful eyes that cataloged everything and discarded nothing, and he looked at Cyrus for a moment and said, "Watkins, I heard you were dead." "Not yet," Cyrus said. "Briggs's office filed a report 3 months ago claiming you'd gone rogue and disappeared into the desert," Harwick said. "The implication was that you'd met with a fatal accident of some kind." "The implication was deliberate," Cyrus said. "I need to tell you why. It took 2 hours." Harwick listened with the focused absorption of a man who had been waiting for a specific piece of information to arrive and was now hearing it. And when Cyrus finished, Olive placed her survey documentation on the desk and walked Harwick through the discrepancy between the fraudulent Crane filing and her own official measurements, explaining the mechanism of the land fraud with a precision and clarity that Cyrus watched produce visible impact on the commissioner's face. She knew the legal framework of mineral claims with the same depth that she knew the mathematical framework of surveying, and she deployed both simultaneously, showing not just what the fraud looked like in the physical landscape, but what it would look like in the official record, once a legitimate survey was placed next to the false filing. She was, he realized, not merely providing evidence but constructing an argument, and it was a good one, logically airtight and documentarily supported. When she finished, Harwick sat back in his chair and looked at her with the specific expression of a man revising his expectations upward. He said, "Miss Merritt, your documentation alone would be sufficient to freeze any action on the Crane claim indefinitely. Combined with Mr. Watkins's testimony about the Briggs operation, we have enough for a federal inquiry." "We also have a problem of immediate timing," Olive said. "There are men named Decker and Associates who are aware of this situation, and who are, we believe, currently in or near the canyon where Mr. Watkins's property is located. They may attempt to destroy evidence or create physical facts on the ground before this inquiry can be formally initiated." Harwick was already reaching for paper. "I'm going to write an emergency injunction against any filing under the Crane claim and dispatch it to the Territorial Land Office this afternoon. I'm also going to request a federal marshal from the district office." He looked at Cyrus. You understand that your testimony on the Briggs matter will need to be formalized, sworn statement, eventually a hearing. I understand, Cyrus said. You're willing. Yes. The word was clean and simple and felt like something long overdue. Harwick looked at him for a moment. Good. Then let's begin. They were in Tombstone for 3 days while the federal machinery engaged its slow and deliberate gears. Harwick was efficient for a government official, and by the second day, he had 2 federal marshals dispatched toward the canyon and an emergency communication on its way to the Tucson Land Office, with enough official weight behind it to freeze any action on the Crane claim. During those 3 days, something happened between Cyrus and Olive that was not dramatic in any single moment, but was nonetheless decisive. It accumulated across the small transactions of 3 shared days in a town where neither of them had other obligations. Breakfasts at the small counter in Mrs. Beaumont's hotel, where Olive read the Tombstone epitaph and commented on it with a critical intelligence that made him laugh for the first time in months. Afternoons where he accompanied her while she filed her official survey documentation with the Territorial Records Office and watched the clerk's surprise when her technical credentials proved unarguable. Evenings where they sat on the narrow hotel porch in the cooling October air and talked with the ease of 2 people discovering that the world looks very similar from inside 2 very different heads. She told him about the dark past she had mostly made peace with, the specific loneliness of being a woman with technical expertise in a world that did not consistently believe such a thing was possible, the forced choice she had made at 23 between the conventional life that was available to her and the unconventional one that fit her actual nature. The cost of that choice had been real. She had friends, but she had moved so often for her work that they were scattered. She had the respect of the professional community that used her surveys, but that respect did not sit in a rocking chair across from her in the evenings. She was 30 years old and she had built something genuinely admirable, and she was not sorry for a day of it. But she was honest enough, in the honesty of the hotel porch in the dark, to say that the building had sometimes been lonely work. He told her about Tucson and Briggs in more detail than he had given her on the first night, including the part he had not told himself clearly until now, that the betrayal had not just been Briggs's corruption. It had been the discovery that the framework of law and order he had committed his adult life to was not the fixed and reliable thing he had believed it was, that it could be hollowed out and worn like a costume by men whose actual intentions were its opposite. That revelation had been more destabilizing than the danger, because danger he knew how to navigate. Disillusionment had no trail markers. She listened to that, and then she said something he had not been expecting. She said, "You know what I've learned about frameworks. They're only as reliable as the people inside them. The law isn't the framework. The people who choose to enforce it honestly, even when they're scared and even when it costs them something, those are the framework. You thought the institution was the thing, but you were the thing all along." He sat with that for a long time. The street below the porch was doing its Tombstone business, horses and wagons, and the distant sound of a piano from the direction of Allen Street. And the October stars were coming out over the desert with the extravagant density that only the Southwest can produce. And Cyrus Watkins was doing something he had not done in a very long time. He was feeling something shift inside him that was not grief or fear, but something warmer and more complicated. "You're a remarkable woman, Olive Merritt," he said. It came out more simply than he intended, without the protective irony he might have wrapped around it in other circumstances. She turned and looked at him. In the porch light her face was both very clear and somewhat unreadable, and then she said, "You're a better man than you've been letting yourself be for the past 3 months. I'd like to see what you do with that." There it was. The hidden motive she had never really hidden. She was not merely out here to file a mineral claim dispute and save his life. She was also, in the completely unsentimental and direct way she did everything, interested in him. In Cyrus Watkins specifically, not as a witness to a fraud or an occupant of a contested property, but as a person she had been watching and listening to and finding increasingly worthwhile. He reached across the space between the two porch chairs and covered her hand with his. She turned her hand over under his, which was as close to eloquence as either of them needed in that moment. The federal marshals sent to the canyon returned on the third day with a report that confirmed what Olive had suspected. Decker and his two associates had been located at the disputed property, in the process of erecting a wooden structure that would have constituted a physical claim to the land. They had been arrested under the federal injunction. Decker was currently in the Tombstone jail awaiting transport to Tucson. His two associates, one of whom had attempted to run and one of whom had attempted something more assertive, were also in custody, the second one with a documented injury that the federal marshal's report described in the neutral language of official paperwork as resulting from his own resistance. Harwick brought the report to them over breakfast on the third morning. He also told them that the emergency communication to the Tucson Land Office had produced an immediate response. The Territorial Land Office Director, a man named Colvin, had been informed of the federal inquiry and had, in a development that Harwick described as gratifyingly rapid, requested federal protection for his office records and offered to cooperate fully with any investigation. This suggested to Harwick, and he was precise about saying this was suggestion rather than confirmation, that Colvin had been aware of irregularities in his office's operation and was now choosing the side most likely to prevail. "What about Briggs?" Cyrus said. Harwick paused. "Briggs left Tucson 11 days ago. His whereabouts are currently unknown." The silence at the table had weight. "He knows," Cyrus said. "He knows something has changed," Harwick said carefully. "Whether he knows specifically about your involvement, I can't say, but a man in his position who disappears when a federal inquiry is about to begin has generally made his own assessment of the situation." Olive, who had been listening with her coffee cup held in both hands and her eyes steady on Harwick, said, "Is Mr. Watkins in danger from that direction?" "The honest answer," Harwick said, "is that it's impossible to say with certainty. What I can say is that once Mr. Watkins's formal sworn statement is on the federal record, his value as a target changes. A sworn statement to a federal commissioner can't be unsaid. The information is already in the system. Removing the witness at that point does nothing to remove the evidence." He looked at Cyrus. "Which is why I'd like to take that statement this morning if you're willing." "I'm willing," Cyrus said. The swearing of the statement took 3 hours. It was meticulous and complete, Harwick asking questions in a systematic progression that covered every detail Cyrus had witnessed in the land office backroom. Every name, every date, every amount, every subsequent event he had knowledge of during his 4 years as a deputy marshal. It was, he realized partway through, an accounting that he had owed for 3 months and had been unable to give because he had not trusted himself or the system or the availability of someone honest to give it to. The giving of it now was not just strategic. It was a relief on a level that went below strategy, a physical ease in the chest, the specific release of a man who has been carrying a stone for a long time and has finally set it down. Olive waited for him in the anteroom outside Harwick's office, reading from a small notebook she apparently carried everywhere. When he came out, she looked up and read something in his face. "Better," she said. "Yes," he said. "A great deal better." She stood up. "Then let's go get your land back." They rode back to the canyon the next morning. The federal marshal had left a deputy at the property, a young man named Alderson who had the slightly dazed look of someone assigned to an outpost more remote than he had expected, and who was visibly relieved to see them arrive. The false stakes Olive had identified had been photographed by Alderson using a portable camera that he had apparently carried all the way from Tombstone, and had documented with the earnest thoroughness of someone who understood the legal importance of what he was recording. The cabin was undisturbed. Decker's people had camped outside it but had not entered it, which Cyrus thought was either professional restraint or the specific caution of people who had expected him to be inside and armed. He stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at the canyon. The afternoon light was the particular amber of deep October, the red walls lit from the side, the juniper casting long shadows across the pale ground. He had come here to hide, and the canyon had let him hide. But now the hiding was over, and the thing about the canyon was that it was actually beautiful, which he had been too occupied with his own interior, whether to properly register during the months he had been living in it. He heard Olive behind him and turned. She was standing in the middle of the small room, looking around with the unsentimental assessment of someone taking stock. "It's a good cabin," she said. "The placement is excellent. Good drainage, good sun exposure in the morning, natural windbreak from the north." "Surveyor's assessment," he said. "Partly," she said. She looked at him. "Partly something else." He crossed the room. She did not step back. She was not the kind of woman who stepped back from things, and he had known this about her for days now, and it was one of the many specific things about her that had gotten completely under his skin in a way he had no intention of reversing. Kissed her. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to every other thing, and there was nothing tentative or exploratory about it. It was the kiss of two people who have already understood something and are simply confirming it in the most honest available language. When they separated, she looked at him with those Creekwater eyes. "I have 6 more weeks of survey work in this basin," she said. "I know," he said. "My base camp is 2 hours east of here. I've been camping in a canvas tent." "That's not necessary anymore," he said. "There's a second room." He paused. "Professionally speaking, you could set up an office, work from here." "Professionally speaking," she said, with a gravity that was almost entirely ironic. "Or otherwise," he said. She thought about it for exactly the length of time it took her to be certain of her own answer. "All right," she said. "Yes." She rode back to her camp the next morning to collect her remaining equipment and supplies, accompanied by Deputy Alderson, who would then continue back to Tombstone, and Cyrus spent the hours of her absence doing something he had not done since arriving at the canyon. He cleaned the cabin thoroughly. He cleared the accumulated clutter of 3 months of solitary habitation. He built proper shelves in the second room from lumber he had stored at the back of the property. He was not a man who expressed himself readily in words, but he expressed himself well in the patient construction of useful things. And when Olive returned in the afternoon with a mule loaded with transit and equipment cases and a rolled canvas, the second room had a solid work table and 3 shelves, and a window he had cleared of the boards that had been blocking the afternoon light. She stood in the doorway of the second room for a moment. Then she said, "Well, that's thoughtful." The warmth in it was real, and he felt it. She set up her survey office in the second room over the next 2 days with the systematic organization of a person who thinks in categories and finds disorder genuinely uncomfortable. Maps covered one wall, pinned in overlapping sections that together composed the full basin. Instruments were arranged on the shelves in order of frequency of use. The notebook she was currently working in had a specific place on the table's left corner, and every other notebook had a year written on the cover in clear notation. He watched her work in the evenings, sitting across the main room at his own table, and found that the silence of the cabin had transformed completely. It was the same physical silence, the same canyon sounds outside, the same fire, but it was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of 2 people in the same space who had agreed, without discussing it, that they did not need to fill every moment with conversation to confirm each other's presence. November came into the canyon with sharper mornings, and a quality of light that was different from October's amber, cleaner and thinner. And Olive's survey work took her out each day into the basin with her transit and her notebooks and her absolute professional focus. He managed the property, did the work of maintenance and upkeep that the cabin needed, made contact with a neighboring rancher named Bates about the possibility of running a small herd on the canyon's grass, and waited for news from Harwick and Tombstone about the progress of the federal inquiry. The news came in pieces over the following weeks. Decker and his associates had been formally charged. The Crane filing had been officially vacated by the federal land commissioner. More significantly, 4 additional properties affected by the same fraud scheme had been identified through the documentation Olive had provided, and the owners of those properties were being contacted, and the fraudulent claims against them similarly voided. Of Briggs, there was still no confirmed news. He had disappeared into the wide country of the American West, which in 1883 still contained substantial capacity for a person to vanish into. Harwick's communications mentioned ongoing efforts to locate him, but these updates had the tone of a man being realistic about the difficulty of the problem. Cyrus thought about Briggs sometimes in the long mornings before Olive came in for coffee, and what he felt was not the burning grievance he had expected but something colder and more resolved. The secret he had carried for 3 months had been given to the appropriate authorities. The machinery of justice, imperfect as it was, had been engaged. Whether Briggs was ultimately found and tried was outside his control, and he had spent enough of his life learning the difference between things inside and outside his control to know that accepting the latter was not the same as not caring. He told Olive this one evening, and she said, "That sounds like a man who stopped punishing himself for something that was never his fault." "It sounds like that because it is that," he said. She smiled. It was not a rare expression with her, but each version of it had a specific quality, and this one had warmth and a kind of satisfaction in it that he was coming to understand, she reserved for moments that genuinely pleased her. She was not a woman who performed emotions she did not feel. He loved her. He had been arriving at this realization in stages over the past weeks, each stage a slightly clearer version of the one before it, the way a landscape emerges from morning fog. First the shapes, then the outlines, then the full and honest thing. He loved her intelligence and her capability and her directness and her deep, quiet competence, and the way she looked at him without flinching, and the way she laughed, which was sudden and genuine, and the way she held her coffee cup in both hands in the morning, and the way she explained survey mathematics to him when he asked, with patience and clarity and the specific pleasure of someone sharing something they love. He also loved her because she was not trying to save him or change him or reshape him into something that would fit a predetermined idea of what she wanted. She was simply present with what he actually was and finding it, apparently, sufficient. That was the rarest and most valuable gift. He had not said any of this to her yet. He was building toward it with the care of a man who knows that the most important structures require solid ground and proper preparation. December arrived. Olive's survey contract had been extended by the territorial government, which had discovered, largely through the quality of her existing documentation, that the basin's survey record contained additional gaps and inconsistencies that needed her specific attention. This meant she would be in the canyon through at least February, and neither of them addressed this fact directly, but both of them understood that the extension of the professional contract was also the extension of something else. Christmas that year was quieter than any Cyrus had known, and also somehow more real. Olive found a small juniper at the back of the property and cut it and set it up in the main room with the pragmatic festivity of a woman who believes holidays are worth marking without a great deal of fuss. He bought things in Bates's store when he rode over for supplies. A length of good ribbon, a pair of leather-work gloves her size that were better than the ones she had been using, a book he had seen her note the title of in a letter she had written to a colleague. She gave him a compass, a fine one, brass-cased, with his initials scratched into the case with a tool that was clearly her own survey scribe, the lettering precise and sure. On Christmas evening they sat by the fire and she read aloud from one of the books she had brought in her satchel, a scientific text about geological formations that in her voice became genuinely interesting, and he looked at the firelight on her face and thought, This is what the last 3 months were leading to. Not the fraud and the danger and the 92 days of silence, but this specific evening, this woman, this fire. He said her name. She looked up from the book. He said, I need to tell you something. She put the book down. She turned to face him fully with the attention she gave everything she considered important. He said, I've been thinking about how to say this correctly for several weeks, and I've concluded that there is no correct way. There's only the actual way, so I'm going to say it the actual way. He paused. I love you. I don't mean that as a thing that happened to me out of loneliness or gratitude or whatever else might be the obvious explanation given that you showed up at my door after 3 months of silence and changed everything about what I was doing. I mean it as a specific response to who you are. The whole of who you are. The work and the mind and the stubbornness and the way you spotted that camp sign from the trail and the way you listened to the part about the man in the Dragoon Mountains and the way you looked at me on the first evening and decided I was worth telling the truth to. All of it. I love all of it. The fire was the loudest sound in the room. Olive looked at him for a long moment with an expression he had not seen on her before. Something that was open in a way she didn't usually let herself be. Something unguarded. And then she said, I knew something was different when I spotted you in the doorway that first evening. Something about the way you looked at me that was not how men usually look at me. Most men look at me and see something to accommodate or work around. You looked at me like you were seeing the actual thing and weren't sure whether to be startled or impressed. Both, he said, at the same time. Yes, she said. That's what I mean. I noticed it and I thought, this is an honest man, even in his confusion, and I have wanted to be around honest people more than I've wanted most things. She stood up from her chair and came to sit beside him, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him with the same unreserved directness she brought to everything. And the fire burned down, and the canyon was quiet and dark outside, and it was Christmas night in the Arizona Territory in 1883, and Cyrus Watkins had not spoken to another soul for 3 months before she knocked on his door, and she had changed the count forever in every possible sense. He proposed to her in January, on a morning when she had come back from an early survey run to find him making breakfast with the careful attention he brought to the few domestic tasks he had mastered. And she had come in the door with her cheeks red from the cold and her transit on her shoulder and her notebook already open because she had been recording observations on the walk back. And he had looked at her, and the question had simply been there, ready. The way something that has been approaching from a distance finally arrives. She said yes with the same decisiveness she brought to all her considered conclusions, and then she said, I want to keep my name professionally. Olive Merritt Watkins for everything else but on survey documentation, Olive Merritt, because that's the name that has the established professional record and I've spent 7 years building it. Of course, he said. He had not considered this and she had clearly been thinking about it, which made complete sense because she thought carefully about all the things that mattered to her. And I'm going to keep working, she said. The survey work. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. What would the Arizona Territory do without the most precise land surveyor in the southwestern quadrant? She tilted her head slightly. That's a very specific claim. Can you support it evidentially? I'm a former deputy marshal, he said. I've seen more fraudulent surveys than honest ones. I know the difference. Yours are the honest ones. She kissed him, which was her version of accepting a compliment gracefully. They were married in April of 1884 in Tombstone, in the small courthouse where Harwick had his offices, with Harwick himself signing as a witness, and Mrs. Beaumont from the hotel, providing both a second-hand dress that she altered to fit Olive's specifications, and a wedding cake that she insisted on, and that was better than either of them expected. Deputy Alderson attended, looking slightly less dazed than on his previous assignment, and the Bates family from the neighboring ranch came as well, Mr. and Mrs. Bates and their 3 children, because Mrs. Bates had taken a considerable interest in Olive, and the two women had formed the kind of direct and practical friendship that forms between women who respect each other's capabilities. They rode back to the canyon the next day as husband and wife, which was a phrase that Cyrus turned over in his mind during the ride and found fit better than most things he had tried on in his life. Husband. It was a word that implied stability and permanence and mutual obligation, and all of those things were precisely what he wanted. He had spent enough years in the shifting, provisional life of the frontier lawman. He was 32 years old, and he had found, in the most unlikely way, through the mechanism of a knock on a door at dusk, the person he wanted to be fixed in place beside. The canyon in April was different from the October version he had arrived in, fuller and greener from the winter rains, the creek running clearer and louder, flowers that he did not know the names of scattered among the rocks. Olive knew the names of several of them and told him as they rode, because she had evidently studied botany at some point alongside everything else, which did not surprise him at all. The news about Briggs came in May. A federal marshal had located him in New Mexico territory, in a small town called Mesilla, living under a different name with what appeared to be a substantial portion of the money he had accumulated through the fraud scheme. He had been arrested and transported to Tucson to face federal charges. The trial was scheduled for the autumn. Harwick wrote to Cyrus requesting his presence as a witness for the federal prosecution, which was expected, but was still a thing that required him to sit with for a day before responding. He and Olive sat on the porch in the May evening, the canyon luminous around them in the late light, and he read her the letter and told her what it meant for the autumn. She said, "We'll go to Tucson. I have survey work there anyway." The basin survey is essentially complete, and the territorial office has been asking about the next contract. A pause. "And you need to see that through. You started it. You need to finish it." "We started it," he said. She accepted this with a small nod that was dignified in the way her acceptances always were. Summer in the canyon was hot and bright and full. Olive's completed survey of the basin was submitted to the territorial government in June and produced a response that Harwick communicated to them in writing. It was described as the most comprehensive and accurate survey documentation submitted to the Arizona territorial government in the preceding decade. The letter was addressed to Miss Olive Merritt, which was the professional name on the documentation, and it used language about professional commendation and the possibility of future contracts. She read it twice, and then put it on the shelf in her office among the other professional correspondence, with the specific lack of self-congratulation that was characteristic of her. But he noticed that she read it a third time later that evening when she thought he was not looking, and her face in that private moment had a quality of quiet satisfaction that he found deeply moving because it was unperformed, the real thing. He built a larger table for her office in June, and added a fourth shelf because the notebooks were accumulating, and spent several evenings working on a proper set of drawers for the instrument cases, because he had noticed her spending time she could have been using for other things, reorganizing the cases on the shelves when they became disordered. He was learning the language of her practical needs and responding to them in the way he expressed care, which was through the patient making of useful things. In July, she told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, matter-of-factly, in the same tone she used for telling him the weather or the results of a survey observation, which was the Olive Merritt Watkins approach to all significant information. State it clearly, then deal with what it means. He stood in the kitchen for a moment with a coffee cup in his hand, and then he put the cup down very carefully on the table, as if sudden movements were inadvisable, and looked at her. "You're certain," he said. "I'm a surveyor," she said. "I take precise measurements. Yes, I'm certain." He crossed the kitchen and held her, and she let him, and they stood there in the July morning sun coming through the window, and neither of them needed to say anything because the holding was the thing. "Are you frightened?" he said into her hair. "Useful fear or noise," she said. He laughed. "I'm asking which kind you're experiencing." "Useful," she said. It's telling me to make a plan and be practical and make sure we have everything we need, which I am already doing. A pause. And some of the other kind too. But that's all right. It is, he said, it's all right. He went to Tucson in August to begin preliminary meetings with the federal prosecutor's office regarding the Briggs trial. And he brought Olive with him because her survey documentation was going to be significant evidence in establishing the mechanism of the land fraud. And also because leaving her in the canyon alone, while she was carrying their child, was not something he was willing to do. And she agreed to this without characterizing it as overprotectiveness, because she was also, in her own precise way, calculating the practical realities of the situation. Tucson was a shock after months in the canyon. The city had grown in the years since he had last been in it regularly, the Southern Pacific Railroad having arrived in 1880 and brought with it the specific energy of a place that has just been connected to something larger. There were gaslit streets now in the business district, a proper hotel that was genuinely comfortable, and the whole overlay of a town that was negotiating the transition from frontier settlement to something more permanent. Aldous Briggs's trial began in September 1884. Cyrus Watkins testified for 2 days. He sat in the witness chair in the federal courtroom and spoke, in the clear and organized way he had learned from Harwick's preparation, about everything he had witnessed in the back room of the land office on that September afternoon in 1883, and about the subsequent events, and about the pattern of activity during his 4 years as a deputy that, viewed through the lens of what he now knew, revealed the systematic nature of the fraud. He did not look at Briggs often during the testimony. Once, toward the end of the second day, he did, and what he saw on Briggs's face was not the defiant anger he had expected, but a specific kind of collapse, the expression of a man who had believed his arrangements were permanent and is confronting the evidence that they were not. It was not a satisfying thing to see. It was just a fact. Olive testified on the third day about the survey documentation, and it was the most technically precise testimony the federal prosecutor's office had encountered, the prosecutor told them afterward. She had constructed, from her own measurements and the comparison with the false filings, a complete and rigorous demonstration of exactly how the fraud worked in physical and legal terms, and she had presented it with the same clarity she brought to all technical communication. The defense offered no effective challenge to any of it. Briggs was convicted on all counts in October of 1884. He received a federal sentence of 14 years, which was delivered by the judge with a formality that attempted to be proportionate to the harm done, and fell somewhat short, as judicial formality always does, of fully capturing the human cost of what had been described in 3 days of testimony. But it was something. It was the legitimate machinery arriving, somewhat belatedly, and doing what it was supposed to do. Cyrus and Olive stood outside the courthouse after the verdict, and he took her hand and she squeezed his, and they stood in the Tucson afternoon watching the city go about its business around them. "It's over," he said. "The legal part," she said. "The other parts take longer." "The other parts are already in progress," he said. She leaned against his shoulder briefly, which was a gesture of affection she deployed rarely and deliberately, and therefore he valued it exactly as much as it deserved. They were back in the canyon before the first frost. Their son was born in the early hours of December 15th, 1884, delivered by a midwife named Mrs. Carroll, who had come from the Bates Ranch, and who was, it turned out, an exceptionally experienced woman who had delivered more than 60 children across the Arizona Territory in the preceding 12 years. The birth was long and difficult, and Cyrus spent the hours of it in a state of focused helplessness that was unlike any other experience of his adult life, pacing, preparing, doing whatever Mrs. Carroll directed with the absolute cooperative attention of a man who understands that this is a situation in which he is not the most capable person in the room. Olive, during the long hours, was characteristically herself. Focused, controlled, working with the process rather than against it. And when it was done and Mrs. Carroll placed the child in Cyrus's arms and he looked down at a face that was both entirely new and somehow deeply familiar, he understood that all the preceding events of the last year, the betrayal and the silence and the knock on the door, and the ride to Tombstone and the trial and the Christmas by the fire, had been the terrain that led to this specific point, and the terrain was entirely worth it. He sat on the edge of the bed where Olive lay exhausted but present, and she looked at the child in his arms with the expression she reserved for things she found genuinely magnificent, and he said, "What should we call him?" She looked at their son, who had Cyrus's dark hair and her particular calm watchfulness already present in an 8-minute-old face. "Thomas," she said, "for my father." "Thomas Watkins," he said. "That's a good name." "Thomas Cyrus Watkins," she said. "That's a complete name." He put Thomas Cyrus Watkins into her arms and watched her hold him with the same sure hands that held a surveyor's transit and a compass and a coffee cup in both hands in the morning, and he thought, "This is the life I was going toward when I went into that canyon to hide. I just didn't know it yet." The winter of 1884 into 1885 was the warmest that Cyrus could remember in the territory. Or perhaps everything felt warmer from the inside of a life that had become full in a way his former life had not been. Thomas was a settled, watchful baby who seemed to find the world interesting rather than alarming, and who developed the early habit of absolute focus on whatever was in his immediate visual field that would eventually make people say he had his mother's way of paying attention to things. Olive resumed her survey work in February, when Thomas was 8 weeks old, and she had assessed her own recovery as sufficient, and had arranged with Mrs. Bates to help with the baby on the days when the survey work required long field hours. She did this without drama, because returning to work was not a defection from motherhood but simply the continuation of who she was. And Cyrus understood this because he had understood it from the first evening. The transit on her shoulder and the leather satchel and the creekwater eyes that were looking at a problem and seeing its solution. The new survey contract was for a different area of Cochise County, a parcel in the Sulphur Springs Valley, where the land disputes were different in character from the Crane fraud, primarily boundary disagreements between legitimate landowners rather than manufactured claims, but equally in need of precise documentation. It was good work and she did it well, and the territorial government was learning, with some institutional surprise, that contracting Olive Merritt Watkins produced results of a quality that made subsequent disputes significantly less frequent. Spring came into the canyon again, the second spring since she had first ridden down the trail with the transit on her shoulder, and it was a different canyon now, fuller, more inhabited, a place where a family lived rather than a place where a man was practicing his disappearance. There were horses in the small corral, Luther and Meridian, and 2 new additions. There was a kitchen garden that Olive had planted along the south wall of the cabin, with the same systematic planning she applied to everything. There was Thomas in his basket in the sun, watching the sky with absolute attention. Cyrus stood at the corner of the property on a May morning, looking at the canyon walls rising red and solid around the small claim of life they had established in this hollow, and he thought about the man who had stood in this same spot in October of 1883 and seen only hiding. The canyon had not changed. The man had. He thought about what Olive had said on the hotel porch in Tombstone about frameworks and the people inside them. About how the institution was not the thing, but the people who chose to act honestly were the thing. He had not fully understood it then. He understood it now in the way you understand things that have been demonstrated to you by the actual events of your life, rather than arrived at through thought alone. He heard her voice from the cabin, talking to Thomas in the particular tone she used with the baby that was both tender and informational, because she apparently saw no reason not to explain the world to someone who could not yet fully process the explanation. She was describing the way morning light changed the color of the canyon walls, and the physics of it briefly, and then the way surveyors used changes in light to assess terrain. And Thomas was responding with the focused gurgling sounds that were his current contribution to conversation. Cyrus turned back toward the cabin, toward the life inside it. The trap he had set for himself in those 92 days of silence, the hidden dark past he had been trying to wall away from the present, the forced choice he had believed he faced between safety and honesty, all of it had been dismantled by the simple act of opening a door. She had knocked. He had opened it. She had come in with her transit and her maps and her direct Creekwater eyes and her willingness to be exactly who she was without apology, and she had, without making any production of it, made him be who he actually was again. By the summer of 1885, the Watkins property in the canyon was a functioning small ranch. Cyrus had made an agreement with Bates about running a combined herd on the canyon's summer grass, which provided income that supplemented Olive's survey contracts and gave him the kind of purposeful physical work that suited his temperament. He was not a man designed for stillness, and the 3 months of enforced silence had taught him this about himself with painful clarity. He was a man designed for useful motion, for problem-solving, for the particular satisfaction of things built and maintained and improved over time. The Bates family came for supper on the last Sunday of July, and it was the kind of evening that accumulates slowly and becomes something you remember with specificity years later. The long July light on the canyon walls, Mrs. Bates and Olive in conversation on the porch, while the 3 Bates children chased a dog across the yard, Bates and Cyrus talking cattle and water rights, and the upcoming territorial election with the comfortable directness of men who have found each other reliable, Thomas asleep in his basket under the window, with the absolute abandonment of a child who trusts the world to be there when he wakes up. Olive came and sat beside Cyrus at one point and slipped her hand into his without interrupting his conversation with Bates, and he closed his hand around hers without interrupting it either, and Bates noticed and looked at his wife, who was watching from the porch, and Mrs. Bates smiled in the way of a woman who finds the world occasionally confirming. In September, Harwick wrote with news that several of the additional properties that had been identified through Olive's original documentation had now had their fraudulent mineral claims fully vacated, and the owners had in some cases been able to return to land they had been effectively displaced from for years. The letter used Olive's documentation as the instrument through which this correction had been made, and it was addressed to both of them. Cyrus read it aloud at the table and then looked at her. "Your work did that," he said. "Our testimony did that," she said. "Both parts were necessary." He thought about ultimate sacrifice and decided this was not the appropriate category. What they had each done was not sacrifice so much as finally doing what they should have done in the first place, which was carry forward the thing they had knowledge of. He had just needed someone to knock on his door and remind him that the world was still waiting for him to rejoin it. There is a particular quality of life in a canyon in Arizona territory, in the autumn, that involves the specific color of red rock in the angle of October light, and the sound of a creek that has come down from a wet summer and runs with more confidence than usual, and the smell of juniper on a cold morning, and the sound of a child beginning to find his voice and use it for the early approximations of language, and the sound of a woman moving in the room where she keeps her maps and instruments, moving with the specific confidence of someone who knows exactly what she is doing and finds it deeply worthwhile. Cyrus Watkins sat on the porch of his cabin on an October morning in 1885, exactly 2 years after he had pulled open the door at dusk and found Olive standing there with a transit on her shoulder. And he had a cup of coffee and a view of the canyon walls going amber in the morning light and the sound of his family inside the cabin. And the 92 days of silence were a long time ago and felt like something that had happened to a different version of him, which was accurate. The count had changed. It was no longer measured in days of silence. It was measured in something else, something that did not have a numerical unit because it was not the kind of thing that is properly captured by numbers, though numbers were his wife's native language, and she would probably have an opinion about this. He was about to go in and tell her that when the door opened, and she came out with her own coffee and Thomas balanced on her hip, pointing at the canyon walls with the imperious interest of a child discovering that pointing produces responses from adults. She sat beside him. Thomas lunged for Cyrus and he caught the boy and held him, and Thomas grabbed his ear with the firm, investigative grip of a person who has decided this is today's problem to understand. "Good morning," Olive said. "Good morning," he said. They sat in the October sun and watched the canyon. "The territorial office sent another contract offer," she said. "The Aravaipa Valley, winter survey, good rates. When do you need to start?" "Late November would be ideal. We could make the canyon our base." "It's not more than 2 days' travel to the survey site." "Thomas, Mrs. Bates has offered, and I think we take her up on it for the field days." She glanced at him. "Could come for the first 2 weeks. I could use an assistant who can be trusted with a compass chain." He looked at her. "You want to teach me surveying?" "I want a competent assistant in the field," she said. "Whether I also want to watch your face when the mathematics comes together correctly and you finally understand why it works the way it does is a secondary consideration." He laughed. Thomas laughed in echo, which was his current most effective social strategy. "All right," Cyrus said. "Yes. Teach me surveying." She looked at the canyon with a small, satisfied expression. The afternoon before they left for the Aravaipa Valley survey, Olive was at her table in the second room, and Cyrus was finishing the repairs to the corral gate, and the canyon was doing its late afternoon thing with the light, going gold and deep, and he stopped what he was doing and stood for a moment in the warm October air, and felt the specific quality of a life that had arrived at itself by the most improbable route. A man who had not spoken to a soul in 3 months. A woman who had knocked on his door with a transit on her shoulder and maps that changed everything and eyes that looked at him and saw what he actually was rather than what he had been telling himself. A hidden motive that turned out to be the simplest thing in the world. She had information that someone needed and she had ridden out to give it because she was a person who did what was necessary and honest. A dark past that the light had eventually found. A forced choice that turned out not to be one. He put down his tools and went inside. She heard him come in and called from the second room, "Did you get the gate finished?" "Yes," he said. She appeared in the doorway of her office with a map in one hand and a question on her face. He said, "I wanted to tell you something. You just told me the gate is finished." "Something else," he said. "Something I've been wanting to say and not finding the exact moment for, except that the exact moment has been every moment for the past year, and I keep waiting for a more ceremonially appropriate one." He looked at her. "I'm glad you knocked on the door. I'm glad you rode all the way out here with your transit and your maps. I'm glad you decided the information was worth the risk. I'm glad every single thing about it, and I'm going to be glad about it for the rest of my life." She looked at him for a moment with the Creekwater eyes. Then she set the map down on the table behind her and crossed the room and put both arms around him, and he held her the way the canyon held the sound of the creek, as a permanent feature, as a thing that had always been there and would remain. "I'm glad too," she said, into his shoulder, quietly, with all the precision of someone who means what they say. Outside, the canyon held the last of the afternoon light. The creek ran. Thomas slept. The red walls rose and the juniper cast its long shadow, and the October stars were beginning to think about appearing at the edges of the fading sky. This was the life, not a life. This specific one, built from the wreckage of one man's silence and one woman's decision to ride through the dark and knock, built from honesty and courage and the willingness to open the door when something important was waiting on the other side. They went to the Aravaipa Valley in November, and Olive taught him to use a compass chain, and he was a good student, which he would have found surprising 6 months earlier, but which now seemed obvious, because anything she chose to teach was worth learning. They surveyed together through the clear, cold winter days, she with the transit and he with the chain, And the work was precise and purposeful, and they talked all day, and at camp in the evenings, and he understood, working beside her in the field, something new about who she was. That she was most fully herself when the work was in front of her, when the instruments were in her hands, and the problem was resolving itself through her application of mathematics and observation, and that being beside her in that state was a privilege of a specific kind. He told her this one evening, and she said, "You're most fully yourself when something needs to be built or fixed or protected." She thought about it. We're both people who need a problem in front of us. As long as we have different problems, he said, between us we can probably cover most of what comes up. Between us, she said, yes. She was carrying their second child by the end of that survey, and she informed him of this with the same matter-of-fact precision as the first time. And he was prepared this time to simply be present in the moment, rather than do anything as inadvertent as setting down a coffee cup with excessive care. He put his arms around her and she rested against him, and they were quiet for a while in the warmth of the field camp. And somewhere in the Aravaipa Valley, a coyote was practicing its evening commentary on the state of the world, and the stars were the dense, extravagant ones of the high desert night, and the count had indeed changed forever. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1886, small and loud and insistent in her opinions from the first hour, and Olive said, looking down at her with the particular expression she had held for Thomas too, that expression of genuine wonder that the most practical and precise person he had ever known apparently saved exclusively for the arrival of new human beings. "We should call her Frances. It's a name that can hold its own." "Frances Watkins," he said. "That is a name that holds its own." "Frances Olive Watkins," Olive said. "That's the whole name." Frances Olive Watkins was, in due course, going to be a great deal like her mother in ways that would delight and occasionally defeat her father, but that was still in the future. For now she was 10 days old, and Thomas, who was a year and a half in attempting competent walking with mixed results, came to look at her with the serious investigative focus that was already his defining characteristic, and pressed his nose against her cheek with an interest that was not quite proprietary but was adjacent to it. The canyon held all of them. The federal inquiry into the Briggs operation produced its final report in the spring of 1887, and among the documents appended to that report, cited as foundational evidence, was the survey documentation produced by Olive Merritt Watkins. Harwick wrote to tell them this, and to say that the report had been used as the basis for proposed territorial legislation that would require independent verification of all mineral claim filings going forward, which would make the specific form of fraud Briggs had used significantly harder to execute. Cyrus read the letter twice and then said, "You changed the law." "The documentation changed the law," Olive said. "The law changed itself, technically." "Olive," she looked at him with the small, pleased expression. "Yes, I suppose we did." He folded the letter and put it on the shelf in her office, between the professional commendation from the territorial government and the notebook from the original basin survey, and the shelf in that second room was a record of a life fully and honestly lived, one survey, one map, one problem solved at a time. It was the spring of 1887, and Cyrus Watkins was 35 years old and his wife was 32, and they had a 3-year-old son who pointed at everything and needed it explained, and a 9-month-old daughter who had already discovered that volume was an effective negotiating tool. And they had a canyon in southeastern Arizona territory that was theirs and known to the official maps now, accurately recorded, every boundary precise, and they had each other. He had not spoken to a soul in 3 months before she knocked on that door. He had not stopped speaking since. There are knocks that happen and pass and you move on. And there are knocks that you open the door to, and on the other side of the door is the rest of your life, specific and extraordinary, and entirely more real than anything you were doing before. The kind that change the count. The kind that, once you have answered them, Make all the silence that came before make sense as a preparation rather than a destination. The kind you spend the rest of your days being grateful you did not pretend not to hear.